Welcome back to Dungeon Brew. Josh and I are going to be continuing our series on narrative design. Today we'll talk about the primary focus of narrative design. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
All right, welcome back. Today we are talking about the primary focus of narrative design, or where the primary focus should be in narrative design. Last time we had talked about what narrative design is. We just, kind of went into the definition of it. And we went into how TTRPGs are narrative games. They have a narrative system that they work with, and GMs have to be able to understand that and be able to understand the different parts of narrative design to keep that story going and to be able to create an awesome story for the gamers. Some games are more geared towards storytelling than other ones. Josh, what do you say that the main focus of narrative design would be in D&D?
I think that any GM would agree that the primary focus of the game is for everyone to come together and have fun. For me, in addition to that, is telling a really good story. But some players honestly don't always care about the story. I like to play with people who do, which is why we're doing this entire series. But having fun is the answer. Making sure that we are focusing on player immersion, having fun, enjoying the game. Everybody's excited about that D&D session, and they're not dreading it.
So what do you do when somebody's not excited?
Well, you kick them out.
Oh, right, of course. And that's our show today.
No, I think that from a GM, you have to recognize that the story that you're telling, which we talked about this in our first video, is collaborative in nature. Everyone should have a voice in the telling of that story. And so if somebody's not having fun, then you kind of have to assess what you're not doing well to bring them into the story and make it exciting for them. Whether it's from a player perspective or their character's perspective, there might be some element that you're just not adding into it. And so you might have to revisit that or even have a personal conversation with them if they're not enjoying it. But as we talked about in terms of narrative design, this is a collaborative story. All of us as GMs come into the game with an idea, a conceptualization of what our story is going to be. We've been inspired by something. We have a great tale that we want to tell. But you have to be willing to change the scope and sequence of that story if it's not aligning with the players around the table.
While keeping it to the story, while keeping it believable for the characters and not going off the edge or off the deep end doing something completely wild.
Yeah, well, hopefully not. I've seen some that have gone that route, and that's never fun. But yeah, changing the story is usually easier than changing other elements of the game. We talked a little bit about the importance of mechanics, and I know John's going to be talking some about how you can change mechanics. But usually when you're building mechanics for a game, it's in the beginning stages. It's before even your session zero that you have different rule sets that you may be introducing or home-brewed rules that you may be introducing to the game. Once you're actually in the course of gameplay, changing those mechanics can be really hard and really challenging for players to suddenly flip a switch and no longer respond to certain elements like combat or engagement or exploration within the course of a gameplay. And so it's easier sometimes to change your story element as needed to meet the needs of the players around the table to keep them engaged in what's going on. You have to make the story work within gameplay. I guess that's what I'm saying. You want to make sure that you have the players, again, immersed. You want to make sure there's not something happening where they go, well, this just doesn't make any sense. And now they're outside of the game.
Yeah, it's kind of like magic systems in writing when you're writing books and having to make sure that you have that system in line. But knowing that once you have that system in line, you can change the story around to make sure that that system continues to make sense and that nobody can just, do anything crazy with whatever, magic system was there. Would you say that's kind of the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that for a long time, John and I have been looking at our own fantasy series for Thrice Nine Legends and looking at building a gaming system that meets the mechanic of magic within that system because we want to incorporate it within our TTRPGs. And it's been so difficult that now we've had to change the story of Magic a little bit to fit the mechanics of gameplay so that we can utilize those in some systems that already exist. Primarily because I'm not even going to share it. I'm not going to tell people what it is. We'll come up with it eventually. We're geniuses. But that's been a major struggle. For you, though, I was hoping that you'd talk a little bit about suspension of disbelief, because that's what we're talking about here as well, is that players sometimes get into the course of gameplay and something happens that doesn't make sense, and that just pulls them out of the game. So, on that note, how do we keep characters from falling victim to the suspension of disbelief? How do you keep them immersed in the game and engaged in the game?
Well, suspension of disbelief is kind of like imagine, you have your magic system, right? You have your characters, then they're given magic. If you don't have sort of like a preset rules or something,
Mm-hmm.
and you come to a situation where it's like, okay, well, here's this big problem. How am I going to solve this? Well, I could just make them do this with their magic because it hasn't already been
Mm-hmm.
set up or put in place as a rule or something before. And so then the person reading or playing is going to be like, well, why didn't they just do that before? Like if they could do that now, why couldn't they do that before? And it kind of takes them out of the being there in the story and feeling like they're really involved in it. So I think it's kind of important to have certain things already preset, pre lined up as, the rules, and this is how far they can go, and this is what they're capable of doing. Does that answer the question?
It does. It's exactly what I'm talking about because it can be really frustrating when a GM when a GM suddenly puts in some sort of story element or makes an allowance or changes the course of things just to try to force the players onto a certain path or to make something make sense. And it makes the player go, wait, what is happening here? Why is this going on? What is this thing? And it's like they're suddenly just like fixing a problem that pulls the player outside of the story altogether. And you want to
Mm-hmm.
avoid that. That's why you have to make sure that you look at all these elements and look at all these system pieces to make sure that the story is going to make sense. And you're not just like, I don't know, joggling your players that are like, I don't even know what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are the things you got to keep in mind with narrative design. That's the magic of narrative design, really, is being able to keep all those rules in mind. Whether it's like, I keep going back to the magic system because I've been talking about this lately, but whether it's like a hard magic system or a soft magic system, like you still have to know, as the narrative design person, what the rules or what the limitations are going to be, what the costs are going to be to make sure that the player doesn't get pulled out of the storyline with that thought of or that frustration of like, well, that was dumb. Where did that come from?
Yeah, and if you play with that concept a little bit with Magic, I mean, it's very true. You want the story overall to be a reward to the players and not a distraction or an interruption. So if
Mm-hmm.
you are suddenly just like making up Magic rules and having certain things happen that don't make sense, now your story's become a distraction. It's become an interruption.
Mm-hmm.
That lich just disappeared when I was in the middle of battle and I almost killed him when no other creature has done this up to this point. That doesn't make any sense to me. I've been chasing him for this long, and now suddenly he's able to just like refill his life automatically. There's no rule mechanic that allows him to do that. It's things like that where the player suddenly goes, "Wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. This story is no longer a reward to me. Now it's a distraction. It's interrupting the course of gameplay."
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. So another thing that I want to make sure we talk about, and man, there's so much more into this than I thought there was going to be, is talking about motivations a little bit. And this is kind of a twofold thing. One, I am a full believer that what a player wants to do is what the story should be asking them to do. Sometimes you go into a story as a GM with this predefined idea of what your characters are going to do. Oh, all my characters are going to be lawful good or neutral good, and they're going to save the city from the evil, lich and the undead that are raising nearby that are corrupting them. And then my players are like, no, 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 we're going to make evil characters, and we're going to join the lich, and we're going to wreak havoc upon those that, and gain power and all these types of things. And so then you have to redesign the story to fit what your players want to do, because the story should be asking the players to do certain things. So for you, can you talk to us a little bit about motivations and maybe even like a motivations inventory that you would do with characters prior to your narrative design that you'd be doing?
Yeah, so there's a couple different, I guess, universal motivations, and then there's like the motivations that just won't work,
Mm-hmm.
especially with a system, like that comes with D&D. But universal motivations are typically things, like, are your players going to be trying to just gain riches? Are they, go in it
Mm-hmm.
for some sort of treasure? Are they in it for power to be, some, to become a king or to become some sort of leader? Of like a what do you call them? We did it in World of Warcraft. The barracks leader, you had like you would
Oh.
level up to be
Mm-hmm.
the leader of your own, your own group there. But or are they going for the drive of just adventure? Are they
Mm-hmm.
just adventurous, and they're just going to have the adventures and to explore and learn things? And then of course there's heroism. Do they just want to be the hero? Is that
Mm-hmm.
the end goal there? When it comes to things like what you don't want to see motivation wise or what isn't necessarily going to work, especially with D&D, or things like pacifism, because battles are kind of at the heart of D&D. I mean, you go into D&D
Mm-hmm.
knowing that you're going to have battle, moments of battle and jumping into these crazy fights and stuff. So you don't want to try to I guess remove that, or you don't want to forget about that when it comes to creating your motivations for a game, of course. But
Which I will say, I've played with players that have pacifist characters, and sometimes they're motivated by pacifism, and they are fighting for a pacifist world. So
mhm.
it can exist in some extent, but it can be really hard to play that type of character within the game and get other players around the table motivated to play along with you. Because you're
Yeah.
right, it's not necessarily the nature of tabletop role playing games. Usually there is combat involved, and it's a means to accomplish whatever the end goal is most of the time.
Yeah. And I think it's okay for a character to, to have a
Mm-hmm.
pacifist in your party, but to have everybody be working towards some sort of,
Mm-hmm.
pacifist world, on like a global level
Mm-hmm.
or something. I don't know how that would necessarily work out with it. But
But it's true. All players should have motivations kind of identified for the characters that they have, and you want to work that into your design of the game, making sure that their motivations are being fulfilled. Many times you'll see in gameplay that you've created a story, you have all these elements, you're trying to push your characters along, and they're just completely bypassing quest lines. They're bypassing NPCs. They're not engaging with things that you've put on the road along the way, and it's because there's no interest. It doesn't align with their motivations. They don't have any buy-in to pursue the thing that has been built along their path, and that can be really frustrating for a GM. Which is why you have to understand what your players want to accomplish.
yeah. And before we go on, I want to say really quick, if you are enjoying this content, please like and subscribe this video so we can continue to be seen to push out more information to all of you wonderful gamers out there. But going off of what you had said, Josh, how would you, as a GM, handle that when one of your characters is kind of veering off the path? How do you keep that sense of camaraderie, the fellowship, the party? How do you keep the party together when somebody's, bored or heading off in a different direction?
Yeah, this is actually two different things. One, we can talk about character motivations, and then we can talk about player motivations. So I've GM'd over games where there are characters that have different motivations. Some want war, some want peace, some want power, some want riches. And so what I did is I created factions that all of these characters belonged to, and these factions would send them on the same missions together that would have an overarching goal they all had to accomplish, but they all had individual goals that they had received by a little note that I'd passed to them across the table that they wouldn't receive until the day of gameplay of what their faction wanted them to do in the course of that quest or that mission as well. And that was really cool to see, especially when sometimes they had conflicting goals or objectives in the course of the overall mission. So sometimes players came back to their faction and said, I didn't accomplish it. This person's supposed to save the child. This one's supposed to murder the child. But I would create. Children was a bad example. I apologize. But but I would create things where there was like-minded goals, but also individual things that spoke to their motivations. That was a lot of fun. When it comes to players, it has a lot to do with having a good conversation with them. Now, I've lucked out that I've essentially played with the same group of individuals for a decade or two. And so I've played with these players enough that I know how they typically play and what they're motivated by. Some of them really like to have unique mechanics in the game that allow them to accessorize their character to make them be something more than what you would find in a typical player handbook. I have some that really enjoy the aspect of role playing and the ability to build up a story and have elements of their backstory in the course of game that they can engage with and be part of the overall theme of the story that's being told. I have others that just want to get as much power or riches or to build strongholds and have armies. Whatever it is, they have typical things that they like to do in gameplay. They're like common themes that I can pre-set up and prepare before we ever even start gameplay. But you have to have a conversation about their motivations, both as a player and as a character.
Yeah, isn't that what happens like at the session zero
Yeah, at the
of
session zero.
every campaign?
Which this is why we oftentimes will do session zero prior to maybe even getting into some of the narrative design elements. As the GM, you'll create the story, you'll create, you have your mechanic base that you're functioning, and then you have a session zero. Usually prior to session zero, we might ask for character backstories from each one of them so we know what they want to do. This is something that John and I both do. And then we start incorporating some design elements prior to session zero. And then the week between session zero or the 2 weeks between session zero and session one, we're then working on narrative design to create something that speaks to all the players around the table. And this is a continuous process. I'd say probably in the first, well, it's ongoing. It's ongoing. But really in the first 4 to 6 sessions, you're really continuing to shape the story with those around the table to get a good idea of what everybody's trying to accomplish.
Yeah,
Man, I'm
that's
talking
based
a
off
lot.
of what they all do, what they all decide, right? I
Yeah.
mean, if they're, heading in a different direction than the GM initially is planned, then he's going to have to sit and go through, okay, well, this person's doing this. How am I going to ultimately bring them back to, this direction or keeping them together? How can I steal their focus back?
But overall, at the end of the day, and this is why we're talking about this in this video, is that your focus in doing narrative design is to meet those motivations of your players, of their characters that they create, and to make sure that everyone is having fun and they remain immersed within the story that's being told.
How do we want to close this? Is that it? Did we touch on everything?
Judge and brew.